So our next speaker is Dr. Professor Greg Hampikian, who is at Boise State University in Idaho, where he also runs the Innocence Project, but he's also a biologist. He's a noted New York Times editorialist. And he also gets involved in cases where he sees that there's a disparity between truth and evidence and comes down on the side of truth in his work on behalf of science for various people. So here's Greg.
Yay. Wow, thanks. Great introduction. Thanks for being energetic and patient. I want to know what I'm doing here. So, how many people here are judges? I know there's one here. Anybody else? Great. How many from prosecutors or law enforcement? Great. Law students? Lawyers? Great. Okay. So I'm going to try to go through the material rather quickly, but there is homework. I know this is a CLE, so the homework is extra credit. At the end of this talk, there are two motions that I've been asking people to craft all over the country for their particular jurisdictions, and I'm looking for volunteers. So I'll take those folks at the end. But there'll be other homework assignments as we go through this. The first one I'd like to mention is for the people who can influence the laboratories, and that's generally going to be the prosecution side and law enforcement. You heard from a man who was wrongfully convicted. You heard that there's a tool that can re-examine old DNA cases. I have a Justice Department grant for $600,000 to work in 3 states. We're not going to get through a lot of cases, but it's very easy for the labs that have adopted this technology to review old cases. I think by the ethical rules that we were presented, that prosecutors in particular have a responsibility to, through some sort of due responsibility, go back to old cases if you have a tool, and these cases can be reviewed rather quickly using these new electronic tools to look for those needles in a haystack. Nobody's saying that most of the cases were wrongful convictions. But these tools allow it. When I do it, I have to fight through the courts. It takes me 1.5 years just to get the data. I know that a prosecutor who's interested could have it done overnight. So that's homework number 1 for the folks who can do that. Okay, I'm going to give you 13 lessons in DNA. I was a fruit fly scientist. No one invited me to talks like this. I started doing rape and murder about 1998. And just about the time CSI was starting to develop, and now everybody's interested in all this stuff. I'm a critical person by nature, and so I'm going to talk about some of the errors that I've seen. The folks who are the younger lawyers, you'll someday be making fun of everything I taught you because science continues to roll forward, and it rolls over the graves of those of us who came before. So I'm not trying to disparage the science that's been established before, but I'll show you examples where we've shown there are mistakes in the way that DNA is being processed. So I'm calling it 13 lessons. We've talked about the first lesson, which is that probabilistic genotyping is one of the new technologies that has great promise. This is Daryl Pinkins, who was freed at the same time as, cleared at the same time as Roosevelt Glenn. And I had a part in that case, and I'm very grateful to know both of those gentlemen now. Their case was a case of DNA that was inconclusive, according to the state, and by probabilistic genotyping, we got determinate answers that convinced the state. We didn't even have to go to a hearing, convinced the prosecutor. So that's kind of an extra lesson that's already been taught, that probabilistic genotyping is the future. So I'd like to show some quotes. My father was a physicist. The only books we had in the house had a lot of formulas in them or had the biographies of great physicists. This is from the biography of a great physicist about how science is best done. And I've tried to live my scientific career this way. Basically, you count anything that can be counted. You apply math like Dr. Perlin does. And what can't yet be counted, you find a way. And so it was very nice of Professor Watson to say that I would see her year after year working on this case and saying it's going to be solved. someone is going to find a way to count the smaller minor contributors in these electropherograms, and we'll have a definitive answer. And I knew it was coming. I was very glad to see it finally come. The last quote, though, is that science proceeds more by what it has learned to ignore, and that is to determine what was once science and now should be called junk science. That will never end. Some of what I'm saying will be junk science. It's not because I'm a bad scientist, it's because I'm a period person. I'm subject to the laws and the nature of this age, and we constantly have to be fighting. You have to be a fighter. Same thing with the law. The other thing I like to point out for how many defense attorneys again? So we know that a lot of guilty people go through this system. I work on cancer. I have tumors from 60 people who died of cancer in my liquid nitrogen. They died, but we're using their tumors to fight cancer and to save people. And in the same way, every time you go to bat for someone who may in fact be guilty, but you stop the overreach of the state, you're protecting the rest of us. And I think people forget that really it is the defense lawyers who are always protecting us against what the state would like to do to get the bad guy. So these are all from Galileo, and I like to quote Galileo because I was involved with Amanda Knox's case and was very afraid to travel to Italy for a long time. So I like to say everything I can about Italian science. I have an Italian scientist now in my lab, in fact. When I got involved with forensic science, I went to the first forensic science meeting in my career, and the head of the FBI's DNA unit was speaking to a room of about 400 scientists, I don't know, from crime labs all over, and I was a fruit fly professor. And so I don't give credit to my students for going to a talk unless they ask a question. I raised my hand. I thought I had to have a question. I thought it was an easy one. It was a softball question. I think it was Dr. Bedelli who was speaking. And I said, what's the error rate in DNA at the FBI? I thought it was an easy question. They must have calculated it. And what he said was 0. And I said, where did you get such a small ruler? Because that's really hard to measure 0. In fact, I don't know any way of doing it. And that's what was a red flag that right away I had an opportunity. There is something that people are not measuring here that I could measure. So I came up with this to try to show where we were at the time. And I think in a lot of ways we're still there. You still see the tough on crime advertisements, not want to get to the truth, but the tough on crime, which means what we're concerned about is getting the guilty people behind bars. And so if we measure the justice system by the successes, by getting truly guilty people behind bars, then the Salem witch trials were a great success. Why? More than 100% of the witches were convicted, the true witches. The point is you have to measure error. And error is very hard. And in fact, a system can never know its own prejudice. It's just impossible. You have to have something outside of the system to do it. Our software is going to have that same issue. We have to have people outside investigating. Everything we do has to have outsiders. Otherwise, you can't determine. Just think of the founding fathers, brilliant as they were, reading, Catullus, being able to quote Rousseau. They didn't even think about giving women the right to vote. So we're all products of that limitation. Here is DNA and a short, quick lesson. You're going to get a little bit more in the mock trial, I hear. There are 13 required places we have to measure. These are chromosomes. You'd see this on an amniocentesis. The nice thing about human chromosomes is that they're named really easily. Most of them, the tallest one is number 1, and it just goes down from there. They named them before they knew what they were really doing, so they named them by size. But then the FBI came along and said, okay, we're gonna measure 13 of these regions, and all we do is we take a little molecular ruler and we measure how long the piece you got from mom, how long the piece you got from dad. Sometimes they're the same size, both a size 8. Sometimes one's an 8 and one's a 12. That's it. We do that for 13 areas on the DNA. We've identified you to the exclusion of everyone but an identical sibling, pretty much. Okay. This is what an electropherogram looks like. So everybody, you're getting CLE credit. So say electropherogram. Electropherogram. Okay. All it means is the machine pumps this out and it tells us what size the DNA is. So here's one of those 13 locations, and it says a 16 and a 17. Each parent gave one of those to this person. I look up in a table, how frequent is the 16 in the human population, which is actually about 330 Caucasians or something in the database. And I can do some math and say how likely this composite profile is. That's the traditional way of doing it. Here's another electropherogram. So I want you to look at this. And this is an electropherogram. It has an x-axis that shows the size of DNA, and it has a y-axis, how much DNA. There has to be a certain amount for the machine to read. There has to be a certain amount for the lab to say, yeah, we're pretty sure that's a good peak. So every lab validates its machinery and its kits. Here's another electropherogram. You can't see it, but on the last one, the y-axis went up to 1,500. On this one, it goes up to about 80 or 100. This is actually the single electropherogram from the Amanda Knox case. Young woman from Seattle, Washington, who was convicted of murdering her roommate in Italy. This was the only DNA against her. This is what I worked on along with her team in Italy who worked on this. And it has DNA that is consistent with the victim, the murder victim. This is a kitchen knife. It was collected from the man that Amanda Knox was dating, from his house. Little short walk away from the house where Amanda Knox was. How did the victim's DNA get onto the blade of a knife in an apartment where the victim had never been? So it looked like a pretty good piece of evidence until you start looking at it carefully and looking at things like the y-axis. How much DNA is this? How likely is it that this is a good piece of evidence? What happened when they tried to repeat this test? They weren't able to. What happened when we looked for blood on the knife? There was none, down to parts per million. We split the blade. We went into the area where the blade met the handle. Still no blood, parts per million. And so eventually this led to her exoneration. So here's the first official lesson. Serology and microscopy must be documented. Must be documented. Is it documented in the same? When you handle a case where they say it's semen positive, do you see a little like pregnancy test kit that they send you? Do you see photos? Why are you believing them? Why do you believe them? So this is abhorrent to me. Like, how can you possibly pay for a test, the taxpayers, and there's no photo? The photos are free, by the way. It's electronic. So here, you know, I didn't think this was going to be as big an issue as it's turned out to be, but because of things like Lean Six Sigma that a lot of labs are doing, they can't move the DNA to DNA testing unless they find a biological material on, say, underwear. You can't take an alleged victim of sexual assault's underwear and do DNA in a lot of labs unless you have some biological stain that looks like semen. So what are the guys and ladies in the lab doing, women in the lab doing? I know them. I went out drinking with them at a conference, and they told me this is what they were doing. They take the little test strip, and they turn it sideways, trying to see a band, getting grains to line up, grains that might be very weak. Here's an example. This is one of my actual cases. Okay, so here is a control strip. You put a drop of the evidence from the underwear, you get it wet, and you soak it up with a little dropper, put it in there. If it rises to the top, it means it's wicked up, and that's a clear indication that the test is doing its job. There's a monoclonal antibody, just like the pregnancy test. It's down here. Here's a positive control. See the band? That's a positive test for semen. Here is a negative control. No band, but you do have the wicking band. What do you see here and here? So we didn't see this until we asked for it in discovery. Thank goodness they photo. In New York, they don't photo. In a lot of states, they don't photo. I don't know what they do here. There is no proof of these things. Thank goodness this was Georgia, I think, and they still photo. And when the jury saw this, they kind of laughed. The state claimed, this is a weak positive. And I said, how can you call something a weak positive if you don't also have something that's called a strong negative, right? Or a weak negative. In other words, everything becomes a weak positive. Why? Because zero doesn't really exist. And especially in testing, zero doesn't exist. If you look carefully, you'll see there are some grains here in all of these tests. There's a little bit of a positive in every negative test. Here's another example. Different type of semen test. This one's just a colorimetric liquid test. Positive control, negative control. Two pieces of evidence. What are they? Weak positive. Again, when we were able to show this to the jury, they discounted it and they realized it. However, throughout the trial, the prosecutor referred to it as the semen stain because the lab said it was weak positive. When I talked to the people at the New York lab about this, the Office of Chief Medical Examiner, they didn't even realize. The scientists were like, well, we're just pushing it forward to DNA testing where you'll get a real answer. And these are my friends. These are good scientists. And I said, you realize that if this is underwear from a child and a caretaker has their DNA on it, they might be cleaning the child, folding the clothes, having them on their knee. If their semen is on that underwear, they're going to prison for 20 years at least. And they didn't realize it. It just shows you that these scientists with good intention, just pushing something forward to DNA testing, are causing potentially false convictions. Always check the serology. What's lesson number one? What do you need to see? Pictures. Great. All right. Number two, keep your eye on the suspect sample. And this goes for everybody, right? Law enforcement, you need to insist on this. The best practice everybody knows is you do the evidence first, you finish all the evidence, and then you run the knowns a week later. Labs are doing thousands. This is not tricky. This used to be standard procedure. The FBI, there's testimony from people like Badoli who used to run it about this was a good practice. Well, now they've gone to robotics, and they say, well, we just throw them on the robot. I had an analyst actually say that from the FBI. We throw them on the robot. And I wrote a note to the lawyer. I'm like, does he actually throw them on the robot? So, did you actually throw them? Oh, no, we take them out, we have the tubes, and we pipette them, and we do. It's just same old-fashioned, except they've cut a couple of steps. But they are now, at the FBI, in Idaho and other places, going back to this, where they will put suspect samples right next to evidence, which means they have the tubes out at the same time. And now, in this day and age, we have single molecule resolution, basically. You know, it can happen. You can get a single molecule in and get a profile, right? So this is a very dangerous practice that's kept up, and you need to check, go through the evidence and see where they have suspect samples, and talk to your lab. If you're in law enforcement, talk to your lab. Why don't you just do all of the evidence first? Then we don't have to listen to the defense expert about possible contamination. Just do the evidence first, or send the evidence to a different lab, or whatever you're going to do. But for most labs, this is the best way. They say, the rule is, you have to do the evidence separate from the knowns, from the suspect, in time or in place. And I always like to say, can you actually do something in the same time and place? You're always separated by time and place. The question is how much. The old way was you do it a few days later or a week later, and you keep it clean. It's another example, I'll skip it. Lesson number 3. Please read it. Scientists make simple mistakes. Very simple mistakes. So just because they wear the priestly lab coat doesn't mean we don't make mistakes. Just, ask my lab. I make mistakes all the time. So here's an example of a mistake. Thank goodness the California lab caught it. It was a Las Vegas case. They had a couple suspects. They go to one of them, say your DNA matches. It was an assault and burglary. And the guy was told you'll do 20 years if you don't admit it. You admit it, you'll probably end up doing 7. There's DNA against you. What would you say? The guy said, all right, I'll take it. Went to prison 3 years later. California calls. We got a hit to that forensic sample you loaded. We got the guy in prison. No, we have him in prison here in Nevada. No, we have him in California. Nevada, California. Everybody retests. What happened? 2 guys were suspects. Somebody swapped the tubes by accident in lab. So you have tubes on a rack. The rack is as big as, can you grab my backpack and bring it over here? They're very small racks. I'll show you what they are. This stuff happens. That's why I keep the suspects and the evidence apart. This is just a lab person admitting they made a mistake on cross in a case I was on. Yes, sir, that there was a mistake. So cross them hard. All right. DNA mixtures, we had a lot of talk about. They can be interpreted several different ways. It's open game on DNA mixtures right now. All the DNA mixtures cases that we rejected at the Idaho Innocence Project, I'm re-looking at, because I realized we used to look at them with the wrong interpretive tools. So it's become very difficult. And again, prosecutors, you got to go back and look at these cases. So here's what a mixture looks like. Not just 2 peaks, several peaks. And when do I go to? 12 minutes, okay. So this was from a case I had in Georgia. We ended up taking that evidence. The man's still in prison. His co-conspirator who pointed him out is out, the guy who gave up this guy's name. And the man in prison, Kerry Robinson, said he did it because he thought I talked to the cops. But Kerry Robinson's still in prison. We showed that electropharogram to 17 experts at another lab. This was a Georgia case, went to another state. We've published in a peer-reviewed journal. Out of those 17 new analysts, only 1 agreed with the Georgia lab about the mixture interpretation that Kerry was included. That was the only physical evidence, the only evidence that allowed a co-conspirator to testify against him. 1 out of 17. We also got all 3 possible interpretations when we didn't allow the lab analysts to talk to them. So, again, the prosecutor obligation, if there is contradictory testing, you'll probably not hear about it. You have to ask. You have to ask because the labs put out 1 report, which is the consensus report. But you know what? There were often conflicting opinions in lab about that. I think that belongs in every report. If 2 qualified analysts at the lab disagree, it goes to a 3rd analyst. You need to know the full score, not just who won. You need to know the score. I'm going to skip all these. Valid statistical methods can produce vastly different results. How bad does this get? Well, NIST studied this problem, National Institute of Standard Technology, in their 2005 mixed study, where they gave the same data to a bunch of labs. They came up with statistics that varied over 10 to the 10. That's the difference between going to a judge and saying, yeah, there's $30 damage to my bumper and there's $300 billion damage to my bumper, right? And so what you do, just split it in the middle is what I say. Walk out with 150 billion. So NIST, and I've got a bone to pick with NIST because I ask them, I don't know, every 4 months, when are you going to publish this in a peer-reviewed journal? They have all the slides up on their website. So they did it again in 2013. They did a better study. They give data out to 108 labs. Here's one of their scenarios. They put 4 people on a ski mask. They asked the lab about 3 profiles. 2 of them, the lab knows are in there because they put them in there. 1 of them wasn't, though. And so what happens to that suspect C? You give it to 108 accredited labs that are looking at mixtures. 76 of them say that suspect C contributed and they supply a statistic. This is DNA, right? 76. How many got it right? 7. Did you guys get it right? Or you were the Truly one. And yeah, I heard New York also used Truly, but didn't send the results in and got the same thing. They got an exclusion. So certainly probabilistic genotyping is helping us here. Inconclusive means no conclusion. How many people have had an inconclusive result where the expert still testified and gave some evidence? Anybody? Fortunate. Okay, I'm going to skip that then. If you ever get that, though, I would say get a motion to say inconclusive of inconclusive. We're not going to talk about results. Y-STRs. How many people have Y-STR cases who do that in this state? Okay, so that's just the male chromosome. There are new Y-STRs called rapidly mutating Y-STRs. I'm trying a case in Canada with them right now. They're not being used in the US yet, but they can tell the difference between brothers, between fathers and sons. So this is a new area. But again, watch out for coincidental matches. Why do I know? Because here is a client who was convicted in Taiwan. Mr. Chen, he matched the underwear stain from a victim along with 2 other possible contributors. We asked the court for extra testing. Here's the extra testing, and he's excluded at 2 loci when we go to 23. But you can go even beyond 23 and still have coincidences. This is Chris Tapp. We just got him out last year. In Idaho, there is DNA that excludes him. We want to know who the DNA is, so we went to genealogical testing. The police actually got Ancestry.com's Y chromosome database and found somebody who was a 34 out of 35 match, thought maybe that guy's son, this is Ancestry.com, maybe that guy's son had a mutation and is the real killer. Turns out the son, Michael Ussery, was in the area at the time and makes movies about things called like murderobilia. So they developed him as a suspect. He was also cleared, but that's 34 out of 35 loci with Y chromosome. And so here's the other thing that's happening is single nucleotide polymorphisms. Everybody say single nucleotide polymorphism. Go. Single nucleotide polymorphism. That's another future thing just starting to be used in the courts. When we took the DNA, when the police took the DNA from that case where we got the guy out and sent it to this company, they were able to do this from the DNA. They think with machine learning algorithms and enough samples, they can tell. Certainly eye color, I believe them, for blue and brown, no question. Skin tone, again, at the extremes, you can tell. But facial features, I'm not so sure. So, but that's, coming to a courtroom near you. And they were also able to say that the guy who matched the 34 out of 35Y is not related to the actual semen left on a dead victim. So Y chromosomes can be coincidental matches. I'm going to skip the cold hits part. Mitochondrial DNA. Anybody have a mito case besides the one we talked about? Not being used that much. FBI still uses them. I'll just skip to the case we had just announced, I think 2 weeks ago, 5 men in China who'd been convicted on mitochondrial hair DNA. We finally got the Chinese court to agree with us that without the data, they shouldn't have been convicted. It was just a report that said 99.99% match, which is not how mitochondrial results are normally reported. So I asked for the data. They wouldn't give the data. I don't think they have the data. I don't think anything was ever done with this, but I'm not sure. But the courts agreed enough to free these guys. I'm going to skip the sensitivity. I'm going to actually skip Amanda's case because we're not going to talk about Amanda Knox. I've got 5. So I just want to end then with a warning about contamination. Does it happen? It's kind of thought of as something that the defense brings up, and it doesn't really happen. But yes, it does happen, especially as we're getting so sensitive. This is the Phantom of Heilbronn. My mom lived in France, so I kept track of this case for a while. She killed all these people. She's in syringes, heroin users leave at crime sites. She's on strings that are used to garrote old ladies. They spent a tremendous amount of money trying to find this one. She killed all over Europe. Turns out it was a bunch of contaminated swabs from a woman who worked in the swab factory in Bavaria. So is contamination real? Yes. I'll give you one other example. This is one of my cases in Georgia. One of the longest serving, if not the longest on death row in Georgia. The Columbus stalking strangler, they called him. Anyway, we finally got some of the underclothes from one of the elderly victims who was raped and strangled. We get a stain that looks like DNA. We test it. It's not the Columbus stalking strangler. It's another man. We're waiting. We get a hit to the CODIS database. So a convicted offender. We look it up. It's in Georgia. It's a gun crime in Georgia. We think we got the guy. Everything's good. Then they say, no, there was a contamination event. And so I pressed them. Georgia, what contamination event was there? In 2 separate cases, my case and in that gun case, they loaded up a profile to the national database, right? A profile that has to go through all their checks, like it's not anyone in the lab. They actually have an exclusion database. They sent up a sperm profile that was from semen produced by someone at the GBI. I want to know whose job this is. Who produces semen samples to test instruments or something years ago. That semen sample was not used on any of these cases. It was detected in both of these cases, loaded up to CODIS, gave a hit, and the lab has apologized and said they're going to clean their stuff a lot better now. And they're trying their best, I'm sure, but the point is, this is a reality. So if all there is a DNA match, right, it could happen other ways. You've got to keep that in mind. It can happen other ways. It certainly has happened in some of my cases. My lab's invented a technology to protect DNA samples with a marker. We call them nullimer tags. I won't give an advertisement for them. Lesson 12, familial searching. It works. It's solid science. I know there are civil rights questions around it. Go ahead and litigate it, but the science is very solid. How do I know? I helped French police solve a crime that had gone cold for 10 years. Some semen left on a victim, no hit to the database. What happened? Out of 1,800,000 people in their database, we got one hit when we said, don't look for an exact match, look for a half match. Half at every locus. In other words, dad, son, close relative. And what do we find? We found the dad of a man who died in a car crash. We get the body exhumed, and it turns out he was matched the semen, and one of his co-conspirators has been arrested. So it does work. Litigate the heck out of it, but it's real. The final thing I want to teach you is the likelihood ratio. You're going to hear a lot about likelihood ratios, and I'm pretty sure you don't know what they are because we're not taught about them. We're just taught that it's more likely. Something is more likely. You just got to buy that. Well, if it's more likely, it's more likely. What is more likely? So lesson number 1, I want you to say this. The likelihood of the evidence. Go ahead. The likelihood of the evidence. Given the hypothesis. Always say that. Never say likelihood ratio or this is more likely than that. Always begin the sentence. We're going to say it one more time. The likelihood of the evidence. Go. The likelihood of the evidence given the hypothesis. This means that there are other hypotheses that can be given. This also means that when you have a 10,000 to 1 likelihood ratio, it doesn't mean that this person is 10,000 times more likely than a randomly selected person to have deposited it. That's transposing the conditional. So if I say there is a 10,000-fold likelihood ratio in favor of the prosecution hypothesis, what am I saying? Go ahead, begin the sentence. The likelihood of the evidence, given the hypothesis that the defendant contributed the DNA, is 1.0. It's always 1.0. And then we have to decide what our other hypothesis is. It doesn't mean that that person contributed. So I'm going to try to give you an example, and we'll end with this. Coffee stain on this rug when we leave. $10,000 of damage. 1 in 20 people, it's determined, was drinking coffee in here, including you. Can we do a likelihood ratio? The likelihood of the stain, given the hypothesis that you spilled the coffee, is what? 1.0, 100%. We divide it by some other likelihood. What do we usually do? The likelihood of the stain, given the hypothesis that a randomly selected person who elected the conference spilled it. What is that? How many people had coffee? 1 in 20. So you put 1.0 over 0.05. And now what do we say? It's 20 times more likely that you spilled it than that. No. What do we say? The likelihood of the evidence, given the hypothesis that you spilled the coffee, is 20 times more than the likelihood of what? The evidence given a random person from the conference spilled it. Do you see how boxed in and structured that statement is? And how we could do other things, like maybe there's somebody who came in afterwards who spilled the evidence. What do we know about their coffee habits, et cetera, et cetera? It's always the likelihood of the evidence. I will tell you that every time I go in court, what I hear is, it's 50 times more likely, or it's usually much more than that, 5,000 times more likely that she contributed the DNA than a randomly selected person. That is transposing the conditional, and it's a heinous mistake, but it's used all the time. So please get to know that. Love to talk to you later. I gotta go.